I've become loud. Hello everyone, and welcome to User Testing in Production. I'm going to tell you today how to run a public beta. Before we get started, a bit of introduction and some disclaimers. This is an opinionated talk. Your mileage may vary. My experience with this comes from a 2-year stint I did as a developer advocate at a developer tooling company. And we ran a lot of public betas during this time. Some went well, some went not so well. And throughout this experience, I developed opinions, and you're going to hear them. This is a public beta. This is the first time I've done this talk, so I'll probably be making jokes about that as we go along. Expect rough edges, maybe, and there'll be opportunities to provide your feedback. This advice is not limited to developer tooling, although that is my experience with it. Everything I'm saying will apply even if your end users are non-technical, but the context obviously is going to be different as to, like, they will give you bug reports in different ways if they're non-technical. Not necessarily worse, because developers sometimes don't always write the best bug reports. Anyway, what is a public beta? It's sort of, it's this term that gets thrown around a lot. You find companies that are calling something a beta for years and years on end, and you go, well, is that still really a beta at that point? But it essentially boils down to the idea that you are going to let somebody use a thing while you are still building it. You've got to the stage of building a thing where it kind of works. You want to let people start using it so you can get feedback, but it's not actually ready to be called production. You're not ready to sort of say, okay, this is now our flagship product, or whatever. In a sense, sort of one way of looking at it is we've got a graph here, and it says, you've got your quality of a given product. And the more time you put into developing that product, the closer you will get to perfection. You won't ever reach it, much as we might like to try. And in general, most of your existing products will fall somewhere on this line that we've got here. And when you build an MVP, it's not going to be as good as most of the rest of your stuff, right? And in general, we like to keep trying and improve our product. And so when you launch a new feature, you do want it to be better than your existing products. It's sort of a bit unfair to compare these three concepts on the same graph, because as you sort of skill up as a developer, as your team gets better at doing the work that they do, it's going to take them less time to get to a certain level of quality. But in general, this is kind of the sort of life cycle or not life cycle, this is sort of quality versus time that you put into it as a concept. And what we're going to be talking about is how do you get from an MVP to what you are aiming for your beta. We have certain proxies for quality. It's obviously not something you can say, well, this product has 70 quality and this one has 90 and whatever. But what we can do is we can look at some of the ways that, we tend to measure these. Things like what's on your GitHub backlog. Do you have glaring security issues? Is it little things like, there's, this spacing on this particular bit of UI isn't great. I say little, they could still be huge usability and user experience issues. You can have things like frequency of outages. How often does your product actually not do the thing that it's supposed to do? And friends over at Honeycomb can provide you lots of information if you find yourself with frequent outages and try and reduce those. And we also have user opinions. And if you've built something and you don't yet have people using it, user opinions are going to be very hard to come by. You will be limited to, developers dog fooding something, which is using your own product. You're going to be limited to the opinions of the people who are probably involved in building it, and those are obviously going to be biased. So the idea is to do a public beta to get user opinions and use those also to factor into your proxy for quality. So user betas, public, as a user, if I'm going to do a public beta, it has to be opt-in. And this is where I've been a little bit shaky about calling this a public beta. Technically, you will opt it in by walking through this door. So I'm going to say that that's OK. As a user, you don't want to be forced into using a product that isn't production ready if you don't feel confident using it. At Anvil, we often had people who would remain with legacy systems that we were still maintaining while a new beta was being developed because they simply did not want to use something that was going to change under their feet. That's completely valid. That is the thing you need to provide to users, that they should have the option not to use a beta. And so you can't just say, okay, one day we're all going to move you over to this new thing, and there's loads and loads of bugs, but you have no choice. That's bad, and you will lose trust from your users. Betas also have to be reversible. So you can get up and walk out this room right now if you want. Like, please don't, but you can. If somebody has signed up to use a feature, they should be able to revert to the old legacy version. They should be able to, opt out of using that thing in whatever way it's going to impact their product, your product. They should also be worthwhile to your users. When you run a public beta, your users are providing you with value by giving you their opinions about the thing that you are building and telling you it needs this, it needs that, user feedback, which we will come to later. You need to give them something in return. It needs to be something that they are going to want to do. You're going to need to give them a reason. So this could be something like you're going to give them credits for your product. It could be something as innate as they get to feel a sense of ownership. They get to feel a sense of contributing to the growth of the product that they use. But a lot of the time, it will be because your beta is actually already providing a new feature, a better feature, and they get to use that slightly earlier. So when should you use a public beta? There's lots of different things that you might want to be doing, like new experimental features, and you don't quite know how these are going to interact with other features. You don't know if people will like them. You don't know if people will use them. So you put them out there and you see, okay, what are our usage uptakes? What do people think about these things? You could be sort of essentially throwing spaghetti at the wall. Obviously, every piece of spaghetti you throw at the wall if you're doing this is development time, so use with caution. But if you aren't quite certain of what the thing you are building is, public beta is a good way to find out if people like it. If you are making significant changes to core functionality of the product that your users use, you should run a beta because you do not want to risk your core product no longer working and them having no way to go back. So at Anvil, one of the longest running betas, they're still running it in fact, is, so this is a platform as a service company for building web apps. And the online IDE was essentially the product. And the framework was open source. And they redid the whole IDE. So this sort of drag and drop designer, all the place where you write your code that runs your apps, they had a classic one, and they have the new one that's in beta. And it changed. It was a complete overhaul. That's quite a lot to take in. By the time they launched it, it was already, there were quite a lot of differences between the classic one and the new one. That's a lot to throw at somebody and expect them just to be able to absorb. You need to give people time to adjust if you're going to be doing these kind of things. So that's another reason to, in this sense, you're not so much, it's a public beta, but you're also doing it, the point here is that you're not deprecating the old stuff. Another reason that you might want to use a public beta is you've got varied use cases for the thing you're going to build. You want to see what people are going to use it for. You want to see the weird and wonderful things that they're going to do and unintended use cases. You want to work out all of the bugs that are going to arise from that and handle them before you say, okay, this thing is sort of battle hard and is ready to be called production. And finally, I touched on this earlier, you're not ready to deprecate the existing version of something. So with public betas, sometimes you're building a completely new thing, and sometimes you're upgrading something that already existed. And in this case, the latter case, you don't necessarily want to take away the old thing that people are familiar with before they are comfortable with the new thing. So, basically, you are trying to find times when your users are going to help you get from here to here. So, when should you start one? There is an argument that says, you should start one as soon as you get here, to the MVP stage. And I think this is, there's good arguments for this. I think it's slightly more nuanced than that. I think the actual answer is that you want to start it as soon as it lets your users solve a new problem. So just because something is like a better user experience isn't necessarily enough, they will want to use it. But ideally, your users are going to switch over as part of making it worthwhile to them. They are going to use the new thing because they can solve new problems. This is one that is definitely, in my opinion here, is influenced by being from the developer tooling world. Developers can be very set in their ways sometimes. If the thing ain't broke, don't fix it. Just because the new product is better in some ways, If it doesn't let them solve new problems, they aren't going to use it. So this opinion is influenced by my experience in developer tooling. But I think it's a good metric for when do you actually want to let somebody use something new. Well, because it lets them do something new. You don't want to annoy your users, though. So you could start a public beta too early. You could also start one too late. Ways to annoy your users include, but are not limited to, releasing something that's unusably buggy. Maybe it does technically let me solve a new problem, but it takes like 15 tries to do it, or I can't find the button to do it, or I actually have to go and download the Git repo and figure it out locally and push it back out to the cloud. And there's lots of different ways that you can release something that is technically worthwhile, but so hard to use that it annoys your users. But you could also annoy your users by releasing something that is polished and great, and all the tooltips work, and it's a complete product, but it's wrong. It's the wrong thing to solve the problem that your users want to solve with your software. And this annoys them not just because you've made something useless, but because you've obviously put time into building something without even checking if they wanted it. This is fairly rare in my experience that this happens, but if it does, it sends the message to your users that you aren't listening to them. And one of the things about the public beta that really gives it value is that it makes your users feel like you are listening to them. So if you are going to run a public beta, and you've decided that you're going to start it, and you want to make it available, this new feature, available to your users, you should be documenting it. Documentation is not easy at all, but it is absolutely necessary. And the answer to how can you document it, you're essentially trying to do two versions of reality. This thing exists and you can use it, but it's not official yet, it's not production ready yet, maybe. And the answer is it depends, which is a timeless classic answer, perfect for any situation. But the thing it depends on is whether or not you're building a completely new feature or you're replacing something that's existing. If it's completely new, this is straightforward. It's simple. Simple is not easy. Documentation is hard. But the answer is you just put a section in your docs and you say, here is the new beta feature. You put all the disclaimers saying, we might have frequent outages, it's not feature complete yet, and you just put your documentation there. And if people are using the thing, they know that is where they go to learn about the new feature. If you are replacing an existing feature, this can be complicated because I would hope you already have documentation for your existing feature. And if somebody is using the beta version, they're probably going to go there. They're probably going to go, OK, well, I want to know about feature X. Here's the docs for feature X. And they're going to want to go there to find information about the beta, maybe. You might choose to solve this by having a separate beta section for any public betas that you are running, but this might not be intuitive for your users. So, first option that I would suggest, your documentation has a lot of responsibilities. It needs to be correct. It needs to be complete. You need to actually document all the things that you can do with your software, because if somebody finds something that's non-documented and starts relying on it, then you need to make it clear that you either do or don't support it, and the docs are the way to do that. But it also needs to be clear. People need to actually go to your documentation, find the answers that they're looking for unambiguously. Unclear documentation can be more frustrating than no documentation at all. Both are very bad options, but your docs need to be clear. And if you are trying to document two versions of reality at once, these last two things can be in conflict. You've got two versions of reality. How do I make it clear which one the person should be looking at? So the first option I would suggest is you put your beta documentation in line with any existing docs that you have. So you have the situation where, OK, I've come to look at feature X, and I can go, OK, here is the legacy version. Here's the official version. But if you're using the beta, this is how it works. And this is good for short-term things because there's low overhead in terms of your documentation system. It's just an extra bit of documentation. But it does introduce a lot of noise into your documentation because if I'm not using the beta, I go here and I'm just like, there's all this stuff I don't care about. If you are using the beta, you go there and there's all this stuff I don't care about because you're putting both versions of reality in the same place. This also can introduce confusion because some people might not find it clear that they might not have even known there was a beta. And they'll get confused about, well, why doesn't my version work like this? Well, because you're not using the beta. So this is one option. The option that we went for at Anvil when we were doing the new editor was actually to have two versions of reality. We had two sets of documentation. This was like one markdown file with bits that had flags set on them, and there was a toggle to say whether or not you were looking at the classic editor version or the beta editor version. And what this does is it's very useful for long-term betas because it's worth that engineering overhead, which is the downside, obviously, is that it's a little more complicated to set up this system. But what it does allow is it allows each version to make sense on its own and be clear as to what you're looking for. It is, you still do have to flag up in the beta documentation. Okay, this is for the beta version. If you're looking for the classic stuff, go here, and vice versa in the other. But that doesn't introduce nearly as much visual noise or confusion as the option of doing it in line. So, you've started your public beta. You've started it hopefully at the correct time to not annoy your users and to get maximum value from their feedback, and you know how to document it. The next thing to do is start collecting feedback from your users. And this is why you run a public beta, right? It's because the user feedback is of value to you, it is a proxy for quality of your product, and you're going to use it to drive future development of that product. So the first thing I would say is if you want anybody to do anything, you've got to make it easy for them to do it. You do not want the way to send feedback about the public beta to be really hard to find. Anywhere you introduce friction into that process is going to make people less likely to do it. So have a canonical place for them to send feedback. Have like an email address that they can send it to, have a user forum, have somewhere they know that they can express their opinions about the thing and have those opinions heard. I would say as part of this, you should allow that feedback to be unstructured. You want people to be able to tell you their opinions as they feel them, right, in their own words. And while it is very tempting to sort of have a feedback form with sort of, are you reporting a bug? Are you reporting a UX issue? And so on. What this does is it prejudices the kind of feedback you're going to get. You don't know what you don't know, and your users might have something to say to you that doesn't fit into whatever format of feedback you're expecting. You should be able to let people upload videos of something that's going wrong, maybe append attached log files, traces, that kind of thing, depending on your tool, depending on whether or not they're technical users. You want to be able to allow users maximum latitude to just tell you exactly what they are thinking, because that's what you want. And you don't want your own biases to prejudice them or to interact with what they're actually going to tell you. You don't want to, prejudice that. So, this is a very extreme example of, not doing that, but this is the kind of failure mode that I'm trying to talk about here, is you expect a certain thing, so that's what you get. And if that's the way that you're allowing people to communicate with you, the only communication you get will be in that form. And you're going to miss things. You also can have the option of interleaving feedback points with the product. So, you're using a new feature and there's a little pop-up that says, hey, what do you think? Little interactive chatbot that goes, hey, tell me how you're doing. Hey, can I help you today? But there is something to be cautious of here, which is that you don't want to add user friction, right? Again, you don't want to do anything that is going to drag people out of the process of using their product, or if they are in the middle of, say, using a developer tool. Anything that distracts them from using it is actually going to annoy them, and you are working with a limited budget of user annoyance that you can put up with, particularly with developers. So at this point in my first version of the slides, I had a QR code that would flash up here with the link to a feedback form that you can give me feedback on this talk. And I took it out because I went, I don't want people to get on their phones in the middle of this talk. I want them to be paying attention to me. And I took it out because that is adding user friction into the experience of watching this talk. The QR code is at the end, though. The ways that you can do user feedback in very concrete terms, you can run interviews. We actually we identified some really heavy users of features at Anvil, and we said, hey, would you be willing to come and have a half-hour interview with us? And those were sort of semi-structured. We have various questions that we were asking, that we would always ask, but it was also a free-flowing conversation where people could just tell us what they thought. Obviously, this is sort of specific to, you are investing a lot of time into one user's opinions. It works quite well if you have a small company with a few really heavy users, or a few users whose opinions you trust and you know quite well, and that was the case at Anvil. And this is a way to go really in-depth into How is this particular user interacting with this feature? What are they getting out of it? What goals are they trying to solve with it? And are they able to achieve it? What are the blockers? What would they like to change? And yeah, user interviews. They're pretty cool. Not a lot of people do them, I think. Feedback forms. This is a case where you run the risk of imposing structure upon feedback that is going to prejudice that feedback. The upside is very easy to do. Just send out a link. Hopefully some people will do it. And then you just have your data to read through at your leisure. You have user forums. I am a big fan of having public user forums, particularly for developer tooling, but I think this applies for non-technical end users as well. Somewhere where people can come and discuss with other users of their product, somewhere that's something that's searchable and indexable, so if people are Googling for error problems. This is more of a just developer experience kind of thing in general, but user forums rather than Discord or Slack, I quite like for this. And this also allows a place, okay, I'm going to set up a forum section in my forum for beta feedback. You can ask people to tag their topics with, this is about this beta, and then you can go read through them at your leisure. And one thing that this gives you, that the other formats don't, is the ability to see users discuss among themselves, which can be incredibly valuable. Have a dedicated email address as a really good backup for somebody to say, hey, I found a bug. Hey, this doesn't work how I think it should. This is sort of your last line of, if somebody doesn't know where else to go, they can send an email and say, hey, here's my feedback. You should have at least a dedicated dedicated email address. But I think the others, for the amount of effort that's involved in each, I think the user forums are actually really, really good. And if you don't have one for your product, you can consider setting one up. You can stand up a Discourse server and just have that, and it's super, super useful. So once you've got all this user feedback, right? You've set up, you've made your product public, you've documented it correctly, you have somewhere to point people if they're having issues with it, and your feedback will probably include feedback about the docs as well. I'm using this and this documentation isn't good enough. Your docs are part of your product. That also counts. You have all this feedback. What do you do with it? It's unstructured, ideally. And so what I like to do is I will sort it into buckets. And I think there are 5 useful buckets that you can sort them into. The first is, this thing just doesn't work. It doesn't do the thing. This sucks to hear, especially if you spent time developing the thing. But it happens. It happens more often than you might think. This doesn't work how it should. I can get the thing done, but it sucks. This doesn't work how I think it should. You get this one a lot. I wanted something else. You get this one a lot. You build a new thing that's useful, and people just go, why didn't you build the thing that I want, though? And can I have something else as well? So for each of these, you've got considerations like, what does this actually mean for me? Do I need to act on this? Do I need to respond to this in some other way? So this doesn't work at all. It's more common than you would think. And the number one mistake I have seen people make, usually not publicly, but is to get defensive about it. I spent time building this thing. What do you mean it doesn't work? If the user says it doesn't work, the user isn't able to use it, therefore it has not fulfilled its goal. And it just translates directly into development work. Make the thing work. It didn't send the email it was supposed to send. It didn't publish the app the way that it was supposed to. This doesn't work how it should, which is the case where somebody is like, well, I had to do this workaround. I was able to get my thing done, but it wasn't clear, or the labeling of this thing is bad. This means that your user experience is bad. This means that, yes, it is usable, but the user experience of it is bad. And technically, your thing is a viable product if it fulfills this, but you are aiming for better than that. That's the entire point of running a public beta. And this also translates directly into work. If the user is telling you how they think it should work in order to solve the goal that you are trying to let them achieve with your software, and that isn't what it does, you need to fix it. This doesn't work how I think it should. When you work with developers, you get this one a lot. Why isn't this more like Visual Basic? Well, I can't use my VS Code plugin with this. I can't, And sometimes they're valid. Sometimes the user experience actually is bad, and their opinions should be listened to. But In this case, not always, because people have their own biases, prejudices, foibles, and you actually can't account for all of them. So this one is slightly different from the previous in that it's more subjective, essentially, as a piece of feedback. This is where your unstructured feedback is really, really useful. That's where you'll see this kind of opinion expressed with the nuance that is going to allow you to decide if you want to translate this into work. And the approach that I would recommend doing with this is you discuss this with your users. You post on the forum and you say, hey, we've had some feedback about this. Everybody give us your opinion specifically about this. And you discuss potentially why you made the design decisions that you did, why the thing works the way that it does, and you get their feedback about whether or not they think that's reasonable. But it could translate into work, it might not. This is the most nuanced, I think, of all of the pieces of feedback to interpret. I wanted X instead. Yes, you built me this gorgeous new IDE that lets me do branch development and different environments and tabbed editing and all of these new features, but what I really, really wanted was something completely different. Sure, fine, great. Also, why doesn't this include the thing that I wanted? This counts towards demand for feature X. That's something that your user forums are also really good for tracking, is the number of people who want a shiny new thing. And you acknowledge it. You just say, cool, thank you for saying that you really, really want this. Maybe it's on our development backlog, maybe it's on our roadmap. And you can also say, look, there's a reason why we didn't include it here, because we wanted to ship this thing faster, or this thing is currently blocked by something else. But you don't have to justify this, because this is the case where you've asked for feedback on one thing and they've given you feedback on another thing, and you're allowed to be a little bit annoyed by that, I think. And the last one is, can I have new thing as well? Like, you've done this great work. Awesome, can I have something else? This looks good to me, right? If you ask for feedback on your beta and they don't complain and they say, cool, I want something else, in isolation, as long as they're not saying, well, I have X, Y, and Z problems with this, and can I have something else? The X, Y, and Z problems are useful and probably fall into one of the former 4 categories, or 3 categories, I should say. Count it towards demand for the new feature that they've asked for, and just acknowledge, say, yeah, cool, thank you for expressing your interest in something else. That's not what we're talking about, though. So you've got your feedback, you've put it into these buckets, and you've decided whether or not that's going to translate into action for the development team. The most important thing that you need to do at this point is communicate back with your users, and this is what I see people not doing. In each of those categories, I sort of included, like, does this translate into work? Do you acknowledge it to the users? And this is because in a public beta, again, your users are providing you value in the form of their opinions. And if they don't feel heard, that sucks. It sucks not to feel heard, and that's true of users of a product as it is in any other situation. So make your users feel heard, show them that you value their feedback and that you do take it into consideration, and they will keep giving you more of it, and that is value as much as it can be frustration. So communicating with your users, when you fix something. Hey, this thing didn't work at all. Great, we fixed it. Announce this. Make a big deal of it. Yes, we acted on your feedback. This is great. If you change something, somebody didn't quite like the way something worked, and technically it was acceptable, but you changed it to be more in line with what they actually wanted, you decided that that was worth doing, tell them. Say, yes, we acted on your feedback. This is great. You are heard, and we care, and we want to make something that you want to use. And if you decide not to change something, this one is harder to tell your users. They really wanted you to do a thing, and you decided not to. But acknowledging that rather than leaving them hanging is actually a good thing, because it shows that you've acknowledged the request in the first place, and that is better than nothing. If you also decide to include some context, particularly with developer tooling, people are going to be more likely to be receptive to that. Yeah, we decided not to change this because it would have required, refactoring this entire other thing or something. Whatever you're comfortable telling your users, if you are comfortable sort of telling them that much about what's going on under the hood, it's really valuable, and it goes a long way to showing them that you have considered their opinions. So, what you are aiming for, once you have set up your public beta, you've documented it, you're collecting user feedback, is the situation where your users, you've updated your product, your users tell you what they think, they give you your feedback, and you, as a developer, make and communicate decisions based on that feedback. And then you update the product, they tell you again, so on and so forth. And it goes round and round, and this is called agile. So this is essentially this is what happens when your public beta is kind of at an equilibrium. It's rolling round and round. And that means that you are now in the situation where things can go really, really wrong, because things can. And I think that the things that can go wrong can be sorted into categories based on those 3 steps, those 3 repeating steps. First one, when your product is updated. Let's say you ship something broken. That's going to annoy users. They're going to lose trust. If you ship breaking changes without announcing them, and people are already depending on your public beta as if it were production, which will happen if you have a long enough running public beta, people tend to forget that it can change underneath their feet, and they will get annoyed. And if you let bugs go unfixed for a long time, and these aren't the kind of bugs where it's like, oh, I don't quite like this doesn't work how I think it should, but genuine bugs, letting them go unfixed for a long time, counteracts that work that you've been doing of letting your users know that you care about their opinions. So you actually have to do the work of updating your product and do it well. This is the stuff that's fairly familiar to developers already. This is the stuff that's less likely to happen because this is the meat of being a developer, right? When your users give feedback. Well, the failure mode of this is that they don't. What if you just don't get any feedback? You've got your user forum set up, you've done all the things that you should be doing. Well, maybe you didn't do it right because maybe they don't know how to give feedback. They're using this thing and they're going, oh, I found a bug, but I don't know how to get in touch with the people to let them know. Maybe they can't express what they want to say properly because the only feedback method that you've given them is a very restrictive feedback form with 5 categories and no space for extra notes or only 300 characters to add context. And you miss out on valuable feedback because you've failed to let them actually give it to you properly. And the last one is the worst and the hardest to fix, and that is because if they don't think they'll be heard. If people stop giving you feedback because they don't think that you are going to listen to it and take it into account, this is so hard to fix. And one of the things that public beta relies on slightly is that your users trust you and that your users want to help you build your product. If you don't have this, the way that your beta will fail is because you just don't get feedback. And all of the things that you do while you run a public beta should be with the goal of making sure that this doesn't happen. So, if you've done things correctly, you will get feedback. If you've avoided these problems, hopefully you will get feedback. Once you've got it, you might mess up at this stage, making and communicating decisions based on that feedback. And usually you will make decisions based on that feedback if you have bucketed it correctly and said, okay, well, this translates directly into work, and this is something that I can do to make this better, this product better, based on the feedback. But the way that people fail at this is they don't communicate back, and they lose that opportunity to build user trust. So what this ends up looking like is users fearing like sneaky updates that are going to come take them off guard, and something's going to change under their feet. You're going to ship breaking changes without warning them or without explaining them. There's an entire thread on the Anvil user forum called Sneaky Anvil Updates. That's why I chose that word in particular, because Anvil doesn't version. It's the beta ID. People. It's just updating constantly, and people go, oh, I noticed this thing, and usually it's I noticed this thing has been fixed. The autocomplete is better. Usually they're good. But the fact that that thread even exists represents a failure to communicate by Anvil staff. I don't work there anymore. I can say that. The other thing that can happen when you fail to communicate is that you lose an extra chance for feedback. Let's say I changed something in my product and I said, look, cool, we responded to feedback and we changed this. You might lose a chance for those people to then go, oh yeah, but it breaks that you didn't consider. Or I was relying on holding my spacebar down to heat something up and that triggering a flag. The XKCD comic where somebody has been relying on a bug, essentially. That feedback is also valuable, and you want every single chance you can get to collect feedback. And broadly, users lose trust, and this is the thing that you really, really, really don't want to happen. So those are the things that can go wrong. And hopefully, if you follow my advice, you won't run into these, but they are common failure modes to look out for and try and avert at every single juncture that you are making a decision about how to run this beta. So, we've got this holistic cycle that's running, and eventually you're going to want to finish your public beta. How do you know when it's over? and your feature is ready to become production, Well, when everything's perfect and we've solved world hunger and world peace and everyone's happy and your product is perfect and your users don't have any feedback for you, this will never happen. You cannot wait for this. As much as we love to, it's such a strong temptation to polish a thing, especially when something you've spent a lot of time on, until it shines brighter than the sun. You can't do this. This actually is really inefficient. Because as you get towards the end of this graph, right, you are spending diminishing returns. The longer you spend on something, the smaller gains towards perfection that you're actually making. So the real question you have to ask yourself, when should I wrap up my beta, is really, did you get there? Did you get to what you wanted it to be? Is it good enough? And we go back to our proxies for quality to decide that. You can look at your GitHub, you look at the issues that you have left to solve. Are they of comparable or lesser severity than outstanding issues for the rest of your product? Is this product of a comparable quality in terms of what you could do to get it to be perfect? Does it have more outages? Is it actually more reliable than the previous thing? You may well be a new beta for a new API version. And actually, by the time that you are ready to close your beta, hopefully it has only at most as many outages or bugs, like breaking bugs, as the previous version. But the last one is the thing that you are actually running a public beta to find out, and that is, do your users think it's ready? So this is a tricky one because users also want your thing to be perfect, and they will also encourage you to keep developing the thing until it gets closer and closer and closer to perfection. But you have to sort of look at what your users are saying and maybe start to pay attention to a bit more to some of that feedback of, can I have X instead? Why aren't you doing this other thing? Where are you allocating your development time and efforts and sort of strategic planning? So yeah, all these proxies for quality, you have to measure them to decide if you're ready for this product to actually become general availability and not become the thing that you're spending a lot of development time on. There are other reasons, so feature parity with existing products. If you're doing something like replacing your entire IDE, there should not be any things that you can only do in the old version if they are critical parts of a user's workflow. You need to make sure that if you're going to deprecate something, and there was an excellent talk yesterday about deprecating features, if you're going to deprecate something, you need to know that users aren't going to lose functionality by doing that. So feature parity with any existing product is kind of table stakes. You may also want to unblock future development, and this is sometimes linked to being able to deprecate an older version. You want to do future development that relies on everybody only using the new thing, or relies on this thing actually being your new feature, being reliable enough that you can say, okay, this is actually ready, we're comfortable that this is stable enough, we're comfortable that this is of a high enough quality that we can use it as foundations for building further development. This one, I would say, handled with caution, especially if you are sort of somebody who, and I say this as having worked with founders who are very excited to keep building new things. This can be something that will cause you to actually potentially want to end your beta too early because you actually want to get on and build a new thing. And that's just a very, very easy way to rack up tech debt. Communicate with your users when you are ending your beta. If you're going to deprecate a new version, deprecate an old version, again, as the talk yesterday by the person whose name I've forgotten, the developer advocate at Miro was talking about, communicating with your users so that they are ready to lose access to a previous version if you're deprecating it. If they should not expect significant development to be done on this new thing, you are making a change to how this product is developing. If you are closing out the beta, you need to communicate with that with the users. Otherwise, you'll go, okay, it's done. We're not going to care about your feedback anymore than we would feedback about any other bit of the product. That's a change to their user experience. You need to communicate it. So, wrapping up, what have we learned? Well, I talked about when to use a public beta, when is it going to be useful, when user opinions are going to really drive the future development of your product, and you need them in order to decide if it is of sufficient quality to move forward with making it production ready. We've talked about how to document it so that your users actually know how to use your new thing. Documentation is a part of your product. A lot of the feedback you get will be about your documentation, in my experience, and it forms part of that cycle of updating your product, updating your documentation to match. We've also talked about how you collect user feedback. What should you do with it? How can you make sure that you aren't prejudicing what you'll get by the methods that you provide for people to give you that feedback? And we have talked about when it is time to wrap it all up. And when your thing is finally ready to be production and you can start the next public beta. So, QR code, as promised, you can give me feedback. Yay, user feedback. It's a free text field because I want unstructured data. Please don't be mean. But yes, that has been how to run a public beta. Thank you so very much. You can find me on the Mastodon. You can find me on the Fediverse. Yeah, thank you very much for attending. Actually, remember to drink my water. Right, we have time. We have 20 minutes for questions. Hello, question over there.
When you're collecting your unstructured feedback, what techniques or tools do you use to make it into structured data that you can actually then query?
Good question. When I'm collecting unstructured data from unstructured feedback from people, what tools or techniques do I use to turn it into structured data? This is going to depend heavily on how your team likes to work. We had an enormous Google Drive just full of all kinds of different videos of interviews and where certain things would go as being part of the issue trackers. So some of this will be, once a piece of feedback directly means that you have to do some work immediately, some development work, it'll be on the GitHub, it will turn into a task. Yeah, I'm not sure that we use any particular tooling or techniques. It really is that process of sitting down and going, okay, what is this user telling me with this piece of feedback? And sort of deciding what action that induces in the development team. You might want to have some kind of database where you say, okay, this requires action, this doesn't require action, but it might be interesting to look at later and sort of store it into that. It's going to depend a lot on how you're collecting it in the first place. I think the sort of canonical place for we have work to do on this thing is going to be whatever issue tracker that you use, so GitHub, GitLab, whatever, wherever you're storing your source code, essentially, because that is where work still to be done lives. Yeah, I don't know that I have any sort of a magic tool that can really help, but yes.
Just thinking if it was like lots of text and there are thousands of feedbacks.
Yeah. Yeah, doing it programmatically, I don't know. I think that would be sort of fundamentally hard because what you are looking for is sort of opinions and feelings, and those are very hard to translate into data, right? You have to sort of go through on a very human level and have empathy with the user to try and understand what it is that they're telling you, which is one of the things that user interviews are really good for because you can do that in real time. Yeah, I'm a developer advocate, so I'm always just like, there's the human angle here. I think if you were dealing with sort of, thousands and thousands of pieces of feedback, you may well develop a workflow that handled that better. But I think the trade-off would be that you would miss nuance. Sorry, does that answer your question? Cool. Ash.
I'll use the mic. Hello. Wow, this is really tall. So what do you think about sentiment analysis and using, with a feedback tool, using a scale of smiley faces to talk about how is the experience going, and then give us some feedback?
Ooh, yeah, so the question was on the mic, so we'll move it up. I would want a way to add more nuance than simply that, I think, because if somebody, it's kind of the same as being able to put cards in at the end of the talk, right? If somebody gives me a red card, I want to know why. So I think it would be paired with some way for the user to expound on why they have given the rating they've given. And I might even break it up into, okay, how was the overall experience? How was the experience of this particular thing that maybe you've been experiencing breakages with recently? I'd maybe want to have a more comprehensive thing than that. And then the trade-off there is that it's taking more time for the user to do it. It's more effort, and they might not because of that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for the most part. I thought we use it to help with sarcasm.
Okay. So they said their job, they use it to help with identifying sarcasm. Yeah, developers can, in particular, can be a really sarcastic bunch. And this is one of the things where going through each piece of feedback and sort of trying to understand what the person is actually saying with it is going to help you, because you're going to be able to do that much more accurately if you're looking at it in isolation rather than part of a set of stuff. Yeah, that would be a hard one to pull out en masse, I think. We've never had anyone be really, well, we've had a couple people be really, really mean about the product in these sort of, even in public forums. And that's just, that's a sort of a PR thing that you have to deal with as best you can. But it is also indicative of your users not trusting you or respecting you, which is a problem that you have to solve somehow. Does that answer that? Yeah. Bit of a ramble. Any more? Joe?
Do you have any advice for when you're doing user interviews, like interviewing without asking leading questions or without making them tell you that it's great because you're sat there in front of them?
Yes. So the question is, how do you do user interviews without essentially prejudicing the answers that you're going to get or asking leading questions? So the experience I have with this is one of the co-founders of my last company had experience with doing this as part of, I think, his academic studies. And he came up with a set of questions that we would go through. And they were things like, what size of company do you have? What are the problems that you solve in your everyday? How has the product helped or hindered you in solving these problems? Trying to keep them very, very open-ended. And we never really got through all of the questions in one half-hour session. And that was kind of intentional, because what they were really were jumping off points for the user to start their own train of thought and tell you everything that they thought in their own words. But yeah, it certainly would be possible to run an interview with the sort of, do you like my product? Yes, love it, definitely. And then the aspect that you mentioned of people being less likely to raise problems because you are literally right there in real time. I'm sure that is a factor. It's going to come down to how much your users trust that critical opinions will be heard and respected and taken non-defensively. And that's just a question of building up user trust over time and behaving with integrity as developers and communicating with your users. I'm on my soapbox again, but yeah. Does that answer the question? Cool. Any more? All right, I think we're done. Please feel free to go and get an afternoon coffee and make yourselves ready for the final talks of the day. Thank you so much for attending.